Across the nation, there are so many different types of cover that bass will relate to. But probably the most prevalent, the one that is found the most in our lakes, rivers, and reservoirs is the simple laydown. A laydown is really a perfect hiding spot for a bass to be able to ambush prey that is going by. And no matter if you're fishing during the spring, summer, fall, or even the winter, bass love laydown. But what separates a good laydown from a bad laydown, and what is the best way to fish a laydown? Today, I hope to break that down, so stay tuned. It's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by Sportsman'sOutfitters.com. Right now, Sportsman's Outfitters is still running their cabin fever sale where you can save big money on some of your favorite lures. If you guys haven't taken advantage of this yet, go ahead and click that link down below in the description and save some money on tackles going into this year. Now, some lakes that you go to, there's not a ton of laydowns, but I have been to several bodies of water that have a multitude of laydowns and wood cover for bass to be in. So one of the biggest questions that I always ask myself is what makes a good laydown? Now, although bass are going to use different laydowns during different times of the years, there's really 4 distinctive characteristics that I look for when fishing a laydown. The first thing that I look for that can really make a good laydown a great laydown is scarcity. Like I talked about, some bodies of water will have, tons of laydowns. You go into any major creek arm or pocket and there will be laid down logs and trees everywhere. Although there can be bass on some of those areas, the thing is that it's going to spread the bass out. If you have a large pocket that only has 10 bass in that entire pocket and you have 20 different laydowns, there's gonna be a lot of laydowns that are not holding fish. Now, if you have a similar sized pocket and it only has 2 or 3 laydowns as opposed to 20, those bass are going to be confined to those laydowns. So isolated laydowns, ones that are by themselves, ones that aren't with a ton of other laydowns, is something that I always look for. If I'm running down the lake or if I'm walking down the shoreline and I see a laydown that's all by itself, I know that a lot of times, probably 9 times out of 10, there's probably a bass somewhere in that laydown. Now, the next thing that I look for is the thickness of the logs or the branches. I have fished a lot of different types of lakes from New York to Florida to Mississippi, Alabama, all over the place. But what I've seen when it comes to fishing a laydown is that the ones that tend to produce bass the best tend to have a little bit thicker logs and branches in them. If you have some laydowns that are pretty small, they have really small, like less than 1-inch size branches in them, yes, they will hold bass from time to time. But the ones that are a little bit thicker and not so branchy tend to be the ones that produce more regularly for me. Now, again, I'm talking about laydowns, and there are certain bushes like buckbrush. Buckbrush tends to be a little bit more branchy, a little bit smaller branches, and that is a great piece of cover that bass absolutely love. But I'm not really referring to bushes when I'm talking today. I'm really referring to those laydowns, and it seems like the ones that have the thicker, bigger logs on them tend to hold bass the best. Now, another characteristic that I really like is if you have some depth close by. Now, this doesn't have to be extremely deep water. Sometimes this might only have to be 3, 4, or 5 foot of water. It seems like the laydowns that have a little bit of depth on them are the ones that bass actually live in. Now, I'm not saying that you're not going to catch bass in really shallow laydowns that are in less than a foot of water, but it seems like to me that bass will move into those type of laydowns just to feed, but the ones that they live in, the ones that you find them most of the time in, are the ones that have that little bit of depth in them. If I'm fishing during the winter, spring, or summer, I really like that depth. Now, during the fall, it seems like bass just really relate to bait fish more or less. So sometimes in the fall, those really shallow laydowns, the ones that are in just a foot of water, those tend to produce the best for me during the fall. The 4th characteristic that really is going to separate a good laydown from a bad laydown is actually the location of that laydown. Like we talked about, bass could really relate to any piece of wood out there. But if you have a laydown laydown that's actually on a point, that's really two types of cover and structure that bass really like. That's really kind of like a double whammy. And so that laydown that's on that point is probably gonna outproduce the ones that are on that straight bank. Now, if you happen to catch a bass on that laydown that is on that point, then you don't have to worry about all these other laydowns. You can simply go from point to point to point. And if there's a laydown on that point, good chances are there's a bass on that point as well. That's really what running a pattern is all about. Now, a point is something that came to my mind, but you might actually find that the laydowns that are on creek channel swing banks are the best. So in that case, you might want to look for more creek channel swings. So now that you know what makes a good laydown, let's talk about how bass relate to the wood cover in a laydown. Now, the thing about a tree that has fallen in the water is that the bass could really be anywhere on that laydown. But to me, there's a couple of places that I always want to make sure that I hit when I am fishing that tree. One place I always like to fish is the heart of the cover. This might be a little bit difficult for me to explain, but what I mean by the heart of the cover is really kind of the center point of that laydown that you are fishing. This is typically where the bass have the most cover and the most protection out of anywhere else in that laydown. I remember watching Denny Brower flip jigs back in the day, and he always talked about fishing the heart of the cover. And that is a spot that tends to hold the biggest bass in that piece of cover. Now, another place that tends to hold a lot of bass is the very end of that laydown. This is especially true if you have water that is down. For instance, maybe you have a drought on the lake that you're fishing and that water is a couple feet down, or maybe you fish on a tidal river where that water is going to go up and down throughout the day, or maybe you have a winter drawdown on the lake that you're fishing. If that water is down, it really seems like bass tend to relate to the very ends of that laydown. I've seen it before where you can catch multiple bass on the end of that cover when that water is down, and it can be a great time. Now, another way that I have seen bass relate to laydowns is they actually tend to suspend in the laydown. And we're gonna talk about lures here in just a little bit and how to best attack that laydown. But a lot of times when you fish a laydown log, there's gonna be bass that are kind of on the bottom. So using different bottom bouncing lures can catch you a lot of bass, but sometimes bass are going to be suspended higher up in that water column. I've seen this a lot towards the end of summer, kind of into that fall period of time where the bass are actually suspended. And you can actually miss bass by fishing lures that are on the bottom when you should be fishing lures that are more suspended. Now, before we talk about lures, I kind of want to answer one of the biggest questions that I always hear people ask when it comes to fishing a laydown, and that is, should you make your first cast to the heart of the cover, or should you start on the end of the laydown and work towards the heart of the cover? Now, I have heard this talked about both ways. Some guys say you always want to make your first cast to the heart of the cover because that is where the biggest bass live. Now, other guys say you really should start on the end of the cover and work towards the heart of the cover, because if you catch a bass in the heart of the cover, it's going to spook all those other bass that you could have caught. Now, my honest opinion here is I don't think a bass getting caught is actually what spooks other fish. I think it is you on a trolling motor and being directly over those fish or running into a laydown is what actually spooks those fish. If you think about bass that are on offshore structure, usually what you want to do is get one of them to bite. And once you can get one to bite, usually the other fish bite. And really, I don't think it's any different when you're fishing shallow water cover. If you can get one of those fish to bite, usually the other ones will bite too. Now, like I said, I don't think fish splashing around is going to spook those fish, but a lot of times if you're wrestling a bass out of that cover, you get too close to it, and that is what actually spooks the bass. So as far as answering that question, I really think that if you are fishing a tournament situation where you are focused on catching bigger than average bass, I typically make that first pitch to the heart of the cover because that is where I believe the biggest bass is going to be. Now, I have fished a lot of tournaments that are considered grinder tournaments where it is hard to get 5 bites in a day. And during those type of tournaments, that is typically when I'm going to pitch to the ends of that laydown and work my way to the heart of the cover, because that might actually allow me to catch a few more bass, because sometimes when you are pitching in the heart of the cover, a bass is simply going to get hung up in there and you have to crash into that laydown just to get that bass. And if you do that, you're gonna probably scare the other bass that are in that laydown. Now, as far as my favorite lures to fish in a laydown, the first one that I'm going to go with is actually a square bill crankbait. I think a lot of guys, when they see a laydown, they're gonna think of soft plastics and jigs, and those are great lures to fish, but I really like kind of getting a square bill in there because I think that bass that are living in laydowns haven't seen as many horizontal presentations as they have those vertical presentations. So there are times where I feel like I'm going to get more bites by fishing a bait like a square bill crankbait, which actually comes through that cover extremely easy. Now, kind of being on that same thought process, another one of my favorite lures is a spinnerbait. A spinnerbait will come through wood cover extremely well, and it seems to catch some of the biggest bass that are in that wood cover. Now, something that separates the spinnerbait from a square bill is you can really control the depth at which that spinnerbait is running. A lot of square bills are gonna have a depth that they run to, but a spinnerbait, you can really creep it low down along the bottom or keep it really, really high in order to catch some of those suspended bass. Now, the next lure or lures that I'm gonna go with are your vertical lures like a jig and some sort of soft plastic. If you guys know me, one of my favorite soft plastics is a tube. There's a lot of times that I'm gonna pick up a tube. I think it's just a bait that other guys are not fishing as much, and I love flipping a tube in wood, but it's hard to beat a jig because a jig does tend to get a bigger than average bite. So anytime I know I'm going to get bit on a jig, I'm definitely going to be flipping a jig. Now, another lure that a lot of guys don't always think about is a drop shot. And I am telling you, anytime I am fishing wood cover, a laydown, I will always have a drop shot on a spinning rod rigged up. There are so many times when we're fishing these days that we're fishing behind people, where finesse fishing can get you a lot more bites. And a drop shot actually will come through wood cover pretty decent. Now, a lot of times I'm not gonna have a big leader on that drop shot. I'm gonna have a fairly small leader, something around 4 to 8 inches. But I have seen on multiple occasions, especially when the fishing is tough, that a drop shot is one of the best lures that you can use in a laydown. Now, another type of cover that bass absolutely love are lily pads. And I actually did a full video about lily pads and where you can find bass in lily pads right there. So if you guys like this video, you'll probably like that video. Also, don't forget to click on that Sportsman's Outfitter link, comment below, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.